Welcome everyone, Lucas here. Today's show is called How to Live a Good Life, How to Live a Happy Life. I'm here with Dr. Marc Schulz. Marc is an associate professor of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and he's a practicing therapist. He's the co-author of a new book, which quite literally just came out. The book is called The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness, which we'll be chatting about today. You can learn more about his book and his work at the-good-life-book, The Good Life Book, with hyphens in there. We'll link up in the show notes.com. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lucas. Pleasure to be here.
I know that some people listening, maybe many people years ago and then at different periods, this Harvard Study of Adult Development has come in and out of the zeitgeist and popular thought. I know it's resurfaced again, largely in part to the work that you and your partners have been doing. But for people who haven't heard or people who think they may have heard, can you refresh their memory in terms of what this study is and why it's so significant in terms of studying happiness outcomes over time?
Yeah, no, happy to. It's really a remarkable study that began long before I was part of this world. So it began in the 1930s, and it began by studying two very different groups of, at that time, boys. Almost 2/3 of the sample were a group of boys that lived in the poorest communities in Boston. So these were inner city kids that were growing up in disadvantaged circumstances. And then about 1/3 of the sample lived literally down the block from the kids in Boston, and they were going to Harvard University. So almost 1/3 of the sample were students at the time that had a very different outlook on life. Both studies were interested in trying to understand the factors that led to thriving, so why people might be successful regardless of the circumstances they were growing up in. And those two cohorts of at that time, young boys were followed across their entire lives, so across their entire adult lives, with frequent questionnaires and interviews and observations of them interacting with their loved ones. So it's the longest study that we know of human thriving in existence. Quite a remarkable study. I've been involved with the project for the last 20 years, but it's an extraordinary study to be a part of.
And what did you learn specifically about loneliness? I know this is relevant for a lot of people today.
Yeah, so when we look back over the course of the entire study, there are hundreds and hundreds of scientific findings and articles that have come from the study. But the sort of most consistent signal in terms of what predicts happiness and even physical well-being are people's connections with others. And this is a signal that we began to see very clearly about 30 years ago, initially linking it to happiness and psychological well-being, but also very quickly in a number of studies linking it to people's physical well-being and even how long they live. And that research is consistent with other research that's been done in many countries across different kinds of populations. I should also say, when I talk about this study, we began to incorporate the wives of the original participants, and we're also studying the children of those original participants. So the study now includes men and women. And this is a finding that is true across many studies, that the health of your relationships is connected to not only your psychological well-being, but your physical well-being as well. And I hope we can talk a little bit about why that might be.
Yeah, people have heard these pop health axioms that get tossed around, like loneliness is like smoking eight cigarettes a day and this kind of thing. And, that kind of strikes you. And then you say, that makes sense. But then, wait a minute, how do you know if it's 8 cigarettes per day? It seems like quite a leap. How do social scientists extrapolate something like loneliness and the complex emotional state of being that is that, and 8 cigarettes a day or these sorts of things?
So it's a great question, and I want to be really clear about it as I explain it. I think this is a really strong scientific finding. This is something that we know well at this point, and we know it because it's been found across literally hundreds of studies. So let me talk about how we do this research. So loneliness is a subjective state. It's not about how many people you're surrounded with. So college students, for example, report very high rates of loneliness, even though they're surrounded by thousands of people doing things just like they do every day. So it's a subjective state that we measure by asking questions. Are there people out there that you can depend on? Are there people you can count on when you want to talk about something important? Does someone have your back? Those are the kinds of questions. And remarkably and sadly, 20 to 40%, depending on the survey of the population, says no to all of those questions. So they feel internally very much alone. And then we look at the health outcomes for those people as opposed to folks that answer yes to at least some of those questions. And they're very different health outcomes. So the finding that you're describing is a well-established scientific finding. If you look at the level of risk, it's akin to smoking something like half a pack of cigarettes or to the effect of obesity on our health and longevity. What makes this so important is it's like obesity in a certain way, that because loneliness is so ubiquitous, so many people experience loneliness, 20 to 40% of the population, this is a significant public health problem, a really significant public health problem.
And do you think someone's feeling lonely and that sets off a cascade of hormones that potentially puts you in a susceptible state to X, Y, and Z? Or is it possible that there's just a pro-social aspect of, let's say the person in bed next to you goes, hey, listen, you're snoring like crazy. I think you have sleep apnea. Or like, hey, stupid, stop eating so much Haagen-Dazs, like go to the doctor. Because there's a lot of that intrafamiliar nagging that happens. Like,
absolutely.
Go
I thought
get your
maybe
prostate check, go get your colonoscopy, this kind of thing,
I was going to say, I thought you'd been talking to my wife before I came to you, so yeah. No, absolutely. So the ways in which relationships shape our health there are many pathways, and you're describing two of those pathways. Some of it may just be that people hold us accountable in certain ways for maintaining our health. There's also lots of evidence that if we're friends with people that are doing healthy things, exercising, doing other kinds of important health behaviors, we're more likely to do that. But it's equally true if they're doing not so healthy things, we're more likely to do that as well. So there are kind of myriad of ways that I think relationships help us. One way they help us is they're really good at regulating our stress, that when we get stressed out, when we face a challenge, people often help calm us and help us deal with the feelings that we're having. They can, as you're suggesting, call us out and maybe have us think about things that we should do. Maybe we know we should do, but we're not doing. Or even maybe we're kind of constructing the situation in a way that doesn't make sense. It's just not realistic and we need an outside view. So it helps with stress, but it helps with so many other things. And this is the other side where I think it does get under our skin, besides the regulator of stress. When we're connected to other people, we get a lift in our bodies. And it's an important lift that lift itself relieves stress. So when we experience happiness, it helps down-regulate or shut down or reduce the amount of stress that we're experiencing. But just the experience of joy and connection with other people, we get these important hits of physiological benefits from that. So I would say relationships are quite remarkable. Like if we had time, I could probably name 30, 40, 50 ways in which relationships can help maintain our health.
I think everyone, when they hear that, will intuitively resonate. That just logically makes sense. And then when they look at the data, it's quite startling. The cruel reality of this is, let's just extrapolate here. Let's say someone is widowed and they're in their early 70s and their kids are all grown and their neighbors are all 40 years younger and their career is done and they just are lonely. And it's not that they've made bad life decisions, but now they're sitting there and they're listening to you and me and they're going, yeah, I'm lonely. It seems like a cruel realization. It's almost like, and that's an extreme example, but a lot of people are sitting in other situations where maybe they're divorced and they're stuck in a rural town that they can't get out of because the kids are there. And there's all kinds of these situations. I've worked with clients who do shift work and their life is just sort of impossible for maintaining social relationships. Do you have any just really, ideally we'd all have a loving marriage and kids and but some of us don't. So when they don't have that, what are some things that you found that maybe people can do to bypass that? So
terrific question. I want to start with a kind of recognition that those figures that I gave you, 20 to 40% of the population are lonely. Those suggest that this isn't an isolated problem, that there are a lot of people, not just the 70-year-old who might be widowed, but there are a lot of people that don't experience the kind of connections that we think could be beneficial. So I think the first step is to not beat yourself up about it, that it's good to be motivated to change. That's terrific. But to recognize that there are lots of people that are struggling with this. And part of it is not just individual circumstances, but there are things about our modern world that that have helped put us in this situation. So we're often much more removed from the communities that we grew up in and the families that we grew up in. The internet has had some wonderful benefits. Social media has had some wonderful benefits, but it also challenges us in the amount of time we actually spend in person, in real time, with people that we care about. So important to recognize that a lot of people have ended up in this situation. And one of the things we talk about in the book is this idea about social fitness. So I'm looking at Lucas in this interview, and he's in a gym where I assume you teach yoga. And, really important to think about your social life as a kind of fitness that we need to exercise and maintain, that we take it for granted, even those of us that have connections, that they'll always be there. Stuff happens, people die, people move, and relationships can wither. They can have challenges that we didn't expect in the past. So all of us need to work harder to maintain those relationships. So a place to start, because I think that's often the hardest, is to think about what's important in your life in terms of connections. What are you missing? For those who are lucky enough to have the connections, what do you want to have more of? But for people who find themselves really isolated and lonely, an activity is often the best path forward. So is there something that will get you out of the house? Maybe it's work for some people, but if you're a shift worker or you do work alone, that's not going to be the option. Is there an activity that you can devote some time to? Maybe it's a recreational activity or a hobby that puts you in regular contact for others. That's a really good way. Repeated contact with others is how we get to know people. It's how we make our good friends. So that's a good first start, and not just to let it happen, but to be intentional, to look out for prospects of people that you want to spend more time with. There's a story we tell in the book. I'll just take a minute to describe it. Please. Of a man who was one of our least happy and most isolated men in the study. So we followed people across their entire adult life. So we tracked it, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, pretty miserable and pretty isolated. He was married, but it was a very unhappy marriage. The only source of joy in his life was his work. And because of physical problems, he couldn't continue to do that work in his 60s. He went to a gym, somewhat worrying about his health and physical health for the future, but what he got was something quite different. He saw people on a regular basis. He started to recognize faces and recognize for the first time that he enjoyed that regular contact with people. And he shared that he loved old movies, and it turned out a bunch of people there kind of enjoyed his take on these old movies. And he would have people over to his house for screenings. And in his late 60s and 70s, he reported to the study for the first time he had friends. Across a 60-year period, this was a man that was devoid of a kind of network of friends. One important thing to recognize, too, is it's never too late. That this was a man that gained friendships partly through serendipity. He happened to be in a gym, but he was at a point where it was becoming more important for him to connect with others. And he did it.
Amazing. How do you define happiness? I've had so many different happiness people on the show over the years, many of them academics like yourselves, other people. How do you define it?
I'm tempted to ask you to. I'll give you my definition because you've learned a lot. So, happiness usually for social scientists involves two parts. One is that kind of momentary experience of joy or happiness, pleasure, those sort of peaks of pleasure. And we think about that as the hedonic component of happiness. And then on the other side is more of a sustained sense that life is meaningful, that it has a purpose, that there's a kind of general satisfaction with where I am. And that's a more continuous kind of attitude or kind of view of life. And both those components are important. But I want to say that we named our book The Good Life on purpose because it's really important to recognize that it's hard to have either of those two things I described, the momentary happiness and the general life satisfaction or meaning, without fully engaging in life. And when you fully engage with life, you're not going to only experience happiness and joy. Sorrows, losses, all those things come with it. So the good life for us is really filled with engagement. It's leaning into life and particularly into relationships.
And so, objectively, if you took a look at this cohort of people, which you have done, how do you determine this person is unhappy and this person is happy without just superimposing your subjective, this guy's got a nice car, this guy's got a simple life, or whatever your values are?
So what we do is we ask people. So literally, for example, at one point in the study, we called people every night for 8 consecutive days. We intruded, really on their life.
Yeah.
And we asked them essentially to walk us through their entire day, including the feelings that they experienced during the day and the feelings that they had at that moment. So that gave us a kind of snapshot across 8 days, though, really a kind of moving snapshot of what their mood was like. And we could tell who reported being the happiest and who was experiencing sort of more difficult emotions. We also observe them in interactions with their partners, and we can see what their behaviors are like. And we do things like bring them into the lab and watch how they navigate stressful challenges. So we can also see how quickly they can recover to a point at which they're experiencing at least calmness and maybe a more positive experience as well. So we try and use all of those ways of triangulating who are the most happy and who aren't, so that it's not our views really that are defining this. It includes their own views, and includes their partners' views as well. So we this is sort of the strategy of scientists. It's always to use multiple methods to try and get at a construct, and that's what we've done over these 85 years now in this study.
What about things like nature? What about things like beauty? What about things like art? Are those all subjective? Are there people who have, lives completely devoid of nature and art and they're happy? Are there people who, is that something you can lean on? Is there any consistency in the data set?
So there is a kind of good literature of research, a good set of findings out there that, going outdoors, being in nature and kind of beholding nature, like seeing the beauty of nature, is something that is connected to happiness. Being active in life, also important to happiness. So a lot of things that you named, there's a kind of research track record that it's connected to happiness. We don't really, I would say, is it possible to be happy with all of those things? Yeah, probably. These are happiness boosters, but there probably are lots of pathways to being happy. And one of the really important ideas, I started to talk about the two very different groups of people that we started to study in the 1930s. And you might expect that kids that were growing up in the 1930s in Boston's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, most of whom lived in tenement buildings, came from immigrant families, didn't have running water at that time in their tenements, that they would have had a difficult and challenging and maybe miserable life. And what we find is they had as much happiness and good experiences in their life, their future life, as these men who were down the block at Harvard, who were in a very different lot. So part of the lesson here is that, of course, your experiences and the context you grew up in matters, but there's so much that's under our control that has an impact on our happiness and well-being.
And if I understand correctly, this study was it's all men, is that correct? And their spouses, is that?
Yeah, so the original participants were young men or boys, and then starting about 30 years ago or so, we started to include their partners in the research. And then about 15 years ago, we started to work with the children of the original participants, half of whom are women and half of whom are men. One really important idea, because very important to recognize that findings are limited to the nature of your sample. So in the book, in The Good Life, one of the things that we did was to look for a signal across many, many studies. So when we talked about happiness before, and I said, I'm sure that these findings are strong, it's because there are literally hundreds, probably 300 or 400 studies at this point that link the experience of loneliness with physical problems. And that's true across countries, across gender, across ethnicity, culture, whatever other kinds of variables that are there.
Where I'm going with this is I'm curious if outcomes and reported, self-contentment, peace, happiness, based on masculine versus feminine tendencies. I'm just curious. I would assume that on average, men would value achievement, and on average, female, feminine-oriented people would value connection and family. But obviously, there's outliers. I'm a family guy. My kids are in that nature. I'm very feminine. My kids are way more important to me than my work. But I'm curious if you've tried to account for that or look at that in the data.
So we did, and we have a chapter, for example, on friendships, and friendships are one of those areas where there's a lot of anecdotal discussion about important differences between men and women and the different roles that spouses will play in traditional marriages in terms of one organizing the social life versus the other. And I think the language that you're using was the important idea that there probably are some small gender differences, so that on average, men may be less social or have fewer friends than women. Yeah. But those differences are strikingly small in most areas. And I think that's really important. And what that means is that men and women, if we stick with this sort of binary distinction, are more alike than different. Yeah. The way you were going is the more interesting idea for men who are more feminine, and maybe value less some of the traditional masculine traits. Are they more likely to value connection with others? And I think the answer to that is yes. But I also want to say these men grew up during the 1920s and 30s at a time when boys and men weren't supposed to talk about their feelings. They weren't supposed to depend on others. So the findings that I'm describing are incredibly clear in this sample of folks, many of whom would talk about as one of their biggest regrets the lack of connections or the lack of maintenance of certain relationships in their life. So these are boys and men who grew up during a time when they were told that you shouldn't worry as much about relationships with others. Achievement and independence were most important. And the signal that comes out of their lives is how important relationships and connections are.
My partner grew up in the Soviet Union, and there's kind of this saying that anyone with a heart misses communism, and anyone with a head hates communism. Those two things together. And I just read Sebastian Junger's Tribes, this book you're probably familiar with, and it kind of, it completely speaks to this point that, people at war, people during hard times, as their city's being bombed, anxiety and depression go down, mental institute. I mean, there's a whole bunch of confounding factors and question marks that come up. But I'm curious if in your work you found that like adversity, misery, war actually lends itself towards, heart-centered connection.
So what I would say is that, the short answer is yes. But I also want to be clear to listeners that, adversity is challenging. It's really hard and it can crush some people. So
it doesn't always work out, right? Yeah.
So no one should seek it out, right? Yeah, but it happens to us. That's unfortunately part of our experience. And the college student cohort was of age when World War II started. 91% of them served in World War II, right? Remarkable in our current way of thinking about things. And they would talk about their experience in World War II in this way that I find quite fascinating. So they would say it was the worst experience of their life. They feared for their lives. They experienced sort of misery and physical challenges that they didn't know they were capable of dealing with. But it was also in a way, and this is almost to a T, they all say this, it was also in a way the most incredible and best experience of their life. And when they talk about what it was that was the best, because we interview them and ask them about it, they talk about the sense of connection they had with people they serve with, this ability to trust people that were next to them literally with their lives, and the ways in which that connection and sense of purpose, they really thought, and they were, saving the world in many ways, that made it the best experience of their lives. Now, many of them were scarred and had challenges and, symptoms that we connect now with PTSD, but they still look back on that experience with a sense that the connection they had was unique, their sense of purpose was unique. So I think that's an important lesson for us about, what can happen sometimes when we're called to kind of raise our game because of a challenge that we could never imagine we'd have to do.
I guess, retrospectively, that's positive. Looking to the future, that's kind of depressing if human nature is such that, war is going to have this positive outcome. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how someone can create a warlike bonding experience without shooting each other in the head.
Yeah. So I again, want to be really clear that adversity is tough and people should avoid adversity. That's not something we want to welcome. People can grow from it. The study teaches it. It's not just about the connections you make, but people can grow and learn from adversity with the right resources and support. But I think there are things that can give us that experience that don't involve wars and putting ourselves at risk and killing others. One of those things is, these calls for national service. So you find in other countries when folks have national service requirements that don't involve military service, that people bond in ways that are quite spectacular. And one of the things it does, you mentioned the idea of tribalism. One of the ways that it's really helpful is that it connects people with folks that are different than than them. So grew up in different areas of let's stick with the United States, grew up in different areas of the states, maybe have a different religious or economic background than them. It makes everyone equal national service. And that effort together can have quite remarkable contributions. I saw one of the most interesting, I happened to be in the United Arab Emirates, which instituted a national service program. And part of their national service program is physical fitness. And they were interested in sort of killing two birds with one stone.
Sure.
They had a challenge with people becoming more obese and more out of shape. These are young people. So the idea of a boot camp was attractive in that circumstance. And it really served that purpose. People got fit. But it also united a country that, for historical reasons, the folks literally come from different clans in the United Arab Emirates, and they look very different. And in this national service, they came together in a way that was quite remarkable. So I had a chance to talk to people in that context. So I think people are talking about that in the States, and that would be one example of a way to get some of that experience without some of the clear negative problems associated with war and military service.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that. I would fully support that. I would probably also have been the 18-year-old who ran across the border to Mexico, but I still support it. I still support it. I would probably dodge my melee service, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Really interesting conversation. Tell people about your book, what you're hoping to, what the goal is with you and your co-author, and where they can find it.
Great. So the book is The Good Life, and it's a book that we wrote because we knew from past experience that people were thirsting for some of the information that was staying in academic journals. And we really wanted to figure out a way to package it so that it would be interesting. And we do that by telling stories. So this is a book that's science-based, but it uses the stories of the participants. And we think tells it in a way that brings people in and helps people learn from the experiences of these folks that have lived a full and interesting life. So the book just came out January 10th. We're talking the day after it was released, and the reception has been spectacular. People can find the book at bookstores and online. We also have a website that I think Lucas mentioned at the beginning, the goodlifebook.com website as well.
One last question before I let you go, Mark. Anything that in your life has taken quite a big right turn after looking at this research, or inspired or scared or frightened by this research?
I would say there's nothing about it that has scared me. That, I'm a clinical psychologist, and there was a moment in my life that I would say when I went to graduate school, I remember being somewhat fearful that it was going to turn me into someone that I wasn't, that I had grown up in a kind of community where people didn't talk that much about their feelings. And I was really interested in this stuff, but also worried that I was going to turn into someone that I used to make fun of or that made me feel uncomfortable. And in graduate school, I got comfortable doing this, and I've done clinical work for over 30 years now. I really get off on learning about other people's lives, and the study has this incredible treasure trove, right? It's 724 life histories packed with information about what life is like. So I feel like it's been a real treat. There haven't been moments where I've been scared. The other thing I want to say, which I think is just a kind of optimistic experience that I've had, kind of profound to be able to look on the lives of so many people and to really read about how they thought their lives would go, to follow them forward and to see what those lives are like. And one of the things that I've experienced in the students who work with me, who are growing up in this period of time, often under very different circumstances than the men had grown up in the study, is at a core level, there are a lot of commonalities that we don't always recognize, that these men growing up in the 30s, serving in World War II, were challenged by some of the same things that 20-year-olds are challenged by today. And that to me is a comforting experience about our common human experience and connection. So that's the feeling I often have when I work with these data.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your work, and let's keep in touch.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you, Lucas. Thank you.